In overviewing the history of any particular phenomenon, it's often difficult to know exactly where to begin. But for our purposes, I think we should begin in the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era is known as a period of political reform and social activism falling roughly between the 1890s and 1920s, and is what we might call the pre-environmental movement in the U.S. Up until the 1890s, the environment was used solely for economic growth. Most efforts around the environment up to that point were really about transferring public resources into private development. Progressivism was meant in many ways to be a counterweight to the concentrated economic power of big business. It was Theodore Roosevelt's attempt to consolidate government control over public land and water resources so as to better protect and manage them for the greatest good for the most people for the longest period of time. Scientific expertise about resources became a foundation for environmental policy. Progressivism was built largely on utilitarian values, and many of the policies were aimed at maintaining natural resources while opening them to human use. One of the biggest shifts we see is the emergence of multiple use resource management, and this included water, land, forests, and even the creation of national parks and wildlife habitats. Those policies were essentially conservation in a nutshell. Conservation focuses on what we might call the proper use of nature. And of course, as you might imagine, Theodore Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot are known as major conservationist thinkers. But another idea to emerge at this time period was what is known as preservationism. And some notable names in this school of thought would be George Perkins Marsh and John Muir, as well as a few others I'll note in a second here. Preservation focuses on the protection of nature from use. Preservationists were influential in the establishment of the National Park Service, founded within the Department of the Interior. And the National Park Service was primarily for preservation first and public use second, which very much put it in conflict with the U.S. Forest Service under the Department of Agriculture. Other notable preservationist thinkers include Aldo Leopold and Robert Marshall, moving us a little bit slightly more towards the present. These people were also influential in the passage of laws like the American Antiquities Act of 1906, which gives the president the ability to restrict the use of public land by executive order through the creation of national monuments. But the modern U.S. environmental movement emerged in the 1960s and 1970s. We often think of this movement's birth as being Earth Day in 1970, but there was a lot going on in the decade leading up to this event. So let's look briefly at a few of the major events across the 60s that led us to our first Earth Day in 1970. One of the earliest would be Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, published in 1962. And this book is credited as lighting the fuse that led to the modern environmental movement. It showed in very clear and accessible prose how the destruction of nature and the threat to human health from pollution were intertwined with one another. This was followed by a series of highly publicized events, the blowout and leak of the Union Oil Company well off the coast of Santa Barbara, California, the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland catching fire due to its heavy pollution by industrial chemicals, mercury scares driving people away from seafood, the closing of community beaches when raw sewage washed ashore. And then there was the symbolic element found in the 1968 photo taken by Apollo 8 astronaut William Anders, known as Earthrise, which has been called the most influential environmental photo ever taken. And it was called that because of the way it called into sharp recognition the fragile nature of our existence and our overall place in the cosmos. Then in December of 1969, Congress passed, and then President Nixon signed, the National Environmental Protection Act, known as NEPA, which was the nation's first explicit environmental policy. It required environmental impact statements by government agencies and required cost-benefit analyses for potentially environmentally harmful projects. Now, while these were some key events sociologically, the forces that led to the modern environmental movement all stem from the rise of industrial production, mass consumption, and suburbanization. Specifically, there were four main forces. One is from landscape preservation groups working to save pristine wilderness from further development and destruction. Another comes from recreation and tourism groups advocating a more conservationist approach. A third force is from suburban governments wanting federal assistance to develop infrastructure such as sewers, waterworks, and transportation. And the last force came from public outrage and industrial and toxic pollution. And these forces all came together at the first Earth Day on April 22nd, 1970. Millions of people participated in a national set of teach-ins and demonstrations, festivals, and speeches. Later that same year, on December 2nd, the EPA was established as a way to coordinate and manage federal programs dealing with pollution and toxic hazards. It was actually created as a reorganization of executive agencies, first suggested at a July 9th proposal to Congress. Ironically, the original impetus came not from the environmental community, but from a presidential commission appointed to generate ideas for streamlining federal bureaucracy. It ended up pitting the federal government against both states and industry, though it was historic in that it was the first agency of its kind in the world, and unlike progressivism and the New Deal, it had bipartisan support. During this same year, Congress passed the Clean Air Act in 1970, which was one of the first things the EPA was charged with implementing. Now, work had begun on this act of February of that year, if you're paying attention, slightly before Earth Day. It was meant to significantly increase vehicle emission standards, reducing various emissions by 90% in 5 years, and improving regulation of fuel composition, establishing national air quality standards for stationary sources like factories and electric utilities, designating air quality control regions, and even setting national emission standards for hazardous pollutants in certain facilities. It passed the House on June 10th by a 374-1 margin. An even stricter version passed the Senate on September 21st by a vote of 73-0. After a 3-month conference period, final versions were passed on December 18th, and the bill was signed into law on December 31st. The Clean Water Act of 1972 took a little longer and was a little bit rockier. Nixon introduced legislation in February 1971. However, Senator Muskie, then a presumed Democratic rival to Nixon in the following year's election, introduced an even stronger bill in the Senate, which passed by a vote of 86-0. Nixon pressured the House to pass a less intensive bill closer to his version, and he succeeded. After meeting 40 times between May and September of 1972, the House-Senate conferees produced a final bill that passed the Senate by 74-0 and passed the House by 366-11. However, even this compromise bill was considered too stringent by Nixon, and in a tactical move, he vetoed the bill on October 17th, the day Congress was scheduled to adjourn for the year. In a surprisingly swift move, however, Congress overrode the veto. The Senate voted to override by 52-12 within 2 hours of the president's announcement, and the House followed suit the next afternoon in a vote of 247-23. Now, of course, implementation of those bills has been less swift and sure than their passage. The nation's attention shifted elsewhere, and various state and industry interests challenged the EPA's implementation of the laws in court, slowing down progress on air and water quality improvement. Nonetheless, even with these challenges, and a few challenges from environmental groups upset that the EPA wasn't moving fast enough, seems you just can't win, these pieces of legislation have ultimately proven to be incredibly successful in improving air and water quality standards in the U.S. While these shifts have certainly not led to some ecological utopia, and there are certainly still key problems and struggles left today, what I want you to take away from this discussion is the power of people to make change. These events came about because people organized. They got out, they got active, and they got together to agitate for the change they wanted. It wasn't easy, and there were continual roadblocks. But a key unifying element across a variety of environmental struggles centers on the ability of people to organize and work collectively. Hold this in mind as we move into specific cases in the weeks ahead.